Hey you guys, it's Professor Vet, and I just wanted to give you guys a lecture here, a little bit of a video background of head and heart. If you recall last time in class, we had a very heavy class regarding Schopenhauer and black metal, and there was Satanism and paganism and unhumanness, right? And it was frankly pretty far out. And so the goal of this class is to give as wide a net as we can possibly give to existentialism. And so the goal here is to find a little bit of early existential thought in Western Christianity. It should give you a little bit of a sense of how dazzlingly rich the world of existential thought is. And also balance out maybe some of what you were experiencing. So the title of this lecture is called Head and Heart, Proto-Existential Thought in Western Christianity. And the one thing I wanted to say about this is that I'm presenting this as a philosopher. So I'm looking at some Christian figures, early Christian figures, depending on how you cut the pie, from a philosophical viewpoint, not necessarily a theological one. And so there will certainly be things that I say in this video that theologians wouldn't agree with, or they might think I'm reading improperly or out of context. That's absolutely fine. But for our purposes, philosophically, it's still pretty illustrative. So let's get rocking and rolling. We're going to be contrasting two worldviews. We're going to be giving two kinds of general ways of approaching things, labels. One of them is Hellenistic, and the other one over here is Hebraic. Now, these are general trends. They are not absolutes, right? It will depend upon the person. It will depend upon the denomination. It will depend upon the passage. Which of these is which, right? Or they're not airtight compartments. I guess that's what I want to say. You can find bits and pieces of each in different thinkers. The Hellenistic worldview just refers to this kind of rationalism that comes from Greek philosophy, really that we tie down to Socrates, although there are some earlier philosophers that are very interesting in that regard. And it's kind of held that that rationalism is sort of the heritage of the Greek civilization in Western civilization. There are lots of other rational systems in the history of thought in the world, but we're just focused here on the Greeks. Socrates is a figure who thinks about a way or starts to question the ways in which we live life. And his goal is really, he has this famous quote, "The unexamined life is not worth living." And so Socrates goes around and asks easy for me to say, asks people questions about what goodness is and what virtue is and what justice is and what piety is and what does it mean to be beloved by the gods and so forth. And in asking these questions, he's asking them because he wants to know how he should be living life. Some people then call him an early form of existential thought. I don't know, but it's true that he's very concerned with how we're supposed to be living life. What's the best way to be living our lives? What would be, I guess, an approximation of what would be an authentic way to live life? Here's a great quote. "There are plenty of persons, I'm so sorry, you guys. There are plenty of persons, as they soon enough discover, who think that they know something, but really know little or nothing. And then those who are examined by them, instead of being angry with themselves, are angry with me." Now this comes from Plato's Apology, where Socrates is talking about kind of how he got himself into this terrible mess. And he's trying to explain to people, look, all I've done is I've gone around and I've asked people to explain what they know. And when I discover that they don't know something, they get upset with me. But it's not my fault that they don't know. And so what he's suggesting here is there's a kind of inauthenticity in other people, that they think they know what kinds of lives they're leading. They think they're living examined lives, but in point of fact, they're not. And as a result, he shouldn't be the object of their consternation or anger. They should. All right. Now, the other side of the coin is the Hebraic heart, right? It's this idea that it's an emphasis not on rationality, but on faith. And if it's one thing I want to say right now about faith is that we should be careful with regard to generalizations about faith. A lot of people think, well, I won't say a lot of people think, that's not right. It's just not. But some people think that religion is sort of the lack of rationality. But I can assure you that's not true. For almost any religious tradition you pick, it will have some rich conceptual schema, I mean, you look at the history of Christianity, dogmatic theologians, it's absolutely chocked full of brilliant people thinking about these kinds of questions. And instead, maybe the best way to think about it is it depends upon the tradition and what you're looking for in the tradition. But generally speaking, there's a tendency to think of faith as a kind of release, that it's important to have faith in things, that things will turn out a certain way. So let's just get a great quote here from Peter 15. But in your hearts revere Christ as Lord. Always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that you have. But do this with gentleness and respect. Okay, what's going on here? This is a passage where a lot of Christian apologists quote this passage as an example of a mandate from God or a kind of prescription from God that it's important to be able to explain your faith for people. Yes, it's wonderful to hope that God exists, but you should be prepared to give reasons to explain why you think God exists, right? So I just point that passage out, not because I'm going to quiz you on it, but because one of the things that people tend to do is they say, well, religion is more about your heart than it is, your head. Well, that's not necessarily true, although your heart is a big part of it. And this will depend upon, the person and their individual faith. But I don't want to give the impression that somehow religious people aren't thinking people. That's just not right. There's just way too much evidence to the contrary for that to be true. So generally speaking, the Hebraic tradition that I'm talking about here has to do with faith, a kind of emotional judgment, a certain kind of emotional certainty rather than rational argument. Hebrews. Now, faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen, right? So it's something that you feel in your heart. It's not necessarily something that you can rationally demonstrate for somebody. Now, you might say, well, that's no good. But remember, existentialists are not necessarily totally on board with reason. In fact, many of them think that reason's only going to get you so far, right? Remember Satpa there. He says, there is no vouchsafe, right, which will guarantee your purpose upon this earth. In other words, you can analyze to death something, right? But eventually you got to take that jump and you've got to say, well, this is what I think this means, right? Kierkegaard talked about it as a leap of faith, that, reason will get you so far, but at some point you have to decide on some non-rational basis. So generally speaking, we've seen in the course that existentialists can be suspect of reason and its capacities and its applications. So when we see that in some Christian thinkers, well, you might see a little bit of a connection there, maybe a thread, maybe an influence. You can also find this in The Watchmen. Now, we didn't read The Watchmen in this class. We didn't discuss it very much. But there's a lead character in there, Rorschach, and he speaks in a kind of funny, pigeony way. But he says, the cold, suffocating dark goes on forever, and we are alone. Live our lives, lacking anything else better to do, devise reason later. Right? The idea is you make up your reasons later. Reason is really subject to other things. It's not really what's governing people in their lives, like Socrates would like. Instead, we use reason to justify what we do later. Now, modern empirical psychology seems to support this idea, at least in some way. This idea that we make up our minds first. Excuse me. As he yawns, right? Gosh, I hope nobody else, I hope that doesn't make you yawn. We make up our minds first, and then we use reason later to kind of help us along. Jonathan Haidt, in this great book, The Righteous Mind, has good examples of this. It's kind of called the constant lawyer. You have this part of your brain that's always willing to engage and generate reasons to advocate for you and what kinds of ideas you have, but they jump on after you've already made up your mind. This is a nice quote from David Hume. Reason is and ought only to be the slave of the passions, and can never pretend to any other office than to serve and obey them. So the idea here is not that reason is in charge, as someone like Socrates would want, but instead reason is really in the back seat. Now, this might give you some sunlight with regard to faith and how you think about faith, and that it's fine to accept things on the basis of faith, because in the end, reason is going to be limited, right? At least according to modern psychology and various thinkers. Now, I want to contrast this for a moment with the alternative worldview, which is that of the head, right? And Nicholas Everett, in his book, The Non-Existence of God, I think it's 2003 or 4, I'm not sure, he kind of addresses this sort of viewpoint. He kind of addresses the existence of faith from the standpoint of someone who's rational in the Hellenistic sense, right? There are two possible bases for a belief. Either you can believe something on the basis of reasons, or you can believe it on the basis of faith. But faith, in this sense, denotes the absence of a basis. And the absence of a basis is not an alternative kind of basis. So you can see how the Hellenistic worldview would kind of reply, right? Somebody says, I believe something on faith, and the response is, well, the absence of a basis is not a basis. It's not an alternative at all. But honestly, the reply, I think, on the other side, on the heart, is to say, you've already, but you're using reason still. See, there's a break there, and one side says, I'm going to apply reason to what you say, and the other side's going to say, no, I've already called that off. I'm believing on the basis of faith, and you just keep on chugging along with the use of reason. Okay, there's a nice anecdote here. There's a modern figure, Richard Morgan, and he's famous for, he was an atheist, a very well read and familiar with all sorts of theological and atheistic arguments concerning the existence of God. And he converted back to Christianity as a result of some online quarrel that these people had. He was part of some website, and in this website, a bunch of people started jumping on a Christian, and Morgan was one of the atheists, and he's like, come on, you guys, be nice, or something like that. And somehow Morgan got in touch with this Christian that everybody was railing on, and this had to do with Morgan's reconversion. But the reason I bring this person up is because Morgan has had a foot in both camps, right? He's been an atheist, and he's returned to theism or Christianity. And he was interviewed on this English show called Unbelievable, which is a good podcast, by the way. It's not super long-form debate, but it's a good back and forth, usually between secular worldviews and religious worldviews and so forth. And they sort of asked Morgan, like, well, what convinced you, from being this sort of hyper-rational atheist to now converting back and thinking with your heart about God? And he said, well, that's the problem, right? It's that God doesn't start with an argument, it starts with a relationship. That's as close as I can get for you guys to connecting these two kinds of worldviews, and I hope in some sense it is sensible, or sensical anyway, it makes sense. There's a great thinker, Martin Buber, and he wrote a masterpiece called I and Thou, and he explains something very similar to what Morgan explained, which is that the relationship of oneself to the holy is not the same as your relationship to a chair, right? You can the word thou is meant to be the familiar form of the word you, and so the idea is that one's relationship with God is a personal relationship. God is not an object in that way. God is more like a person. All right. So let's go here. Romans 10:9. If you declare with your mouth Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. For it is with your heart that you believe and are justified, and it is with your mouth that you profess your faith and are saved. So this is just a straight up example of what it would mean to believe on the basis of faith within the Christian canon, right? All right, John 12:24. I bring this up because it is the start of the Brothers Karamazov. It's a quote that Dostoevsky brings up. And he says in there, Verily, verily, I say unto you, except a corn of wheat fall into the ground and die, it abideth alone. But if it die, it bringeth forth much fruit. Okay, what's going on? Somebody's dying and there's wheat and fruit and what's happening? Okay, the idea here is that if you, with your heart, open your heart to the Lord or to Jesus, then you release the control of your life to God, and in that sense, you die. You acquiesce in control of your life. Your individuality dies in some way because it is dwarfed by this loving presence of God. And in that death, just as the little bit of wheat falls to the ground, and when it hits that ground and then it blossoms, it brings up a bunch of more wheat, so too when you as your person release your life and heart to God, then you land in this soil, right? And then your life blossoms and your life kind of begins anew in a similar fashion. All right. Some figures. Okay, I'm not going to spend too much time on dates here because frankly it's irrelevant, but I just wanted to mention a few people that I think might highlight for you some somewhat existentialist themes in Christianity. Tertullian. Now, Tertullian is a church father you're not going to hear a lot about unless you're really looking for it. But he has this idea that the soul doesn't exist before, right? The soul isn't pre-existent, but it's created somehow by your mother and father, and then who you are is made over time. And you can see how this kind of plays into some different existential themes of becoming who you are, right? That's Nietzsche. Responding to the facts of your life or the non-volitional aspects of your life, the parts of your life that you don't control. There's also this quote that he's credited with. It is immediately credible because it is silly, or another way to read it, it is by all means to be believed because it is absurd. Well, this sounds like Kierkegaard, right? The way that you can read that is as in a straightforward way. There are other ways to read that passage, but remember, we're not going to get into that. This is totally antithetical to Western philosophy that relies on arguments and evidence. And here Tertullian saying, yeah, I believe it because it's crazy. It's somewhat similar to Kierkegaard's kind of idea that, religion isn't rational or supposed to be sensible in that way. The stranger and weirder, the better, right? St. Augustine, who, you hear a lot about St. Augustine with regard to his influence in medieval times, but actually he was an ancient figure. He was a figure in ancient philosophy. And his goal was to try and, oh, by the way, okay, His name is St. Augustine. Some people say Augustine. Okay, the reason why it's better to say Augustine is because Augustine, I guess, is a hair closer to what his name is in Latin. Now, I will never quiz you on this, but you may once in a while run into somebody who says, it's not, Augustine, it's Augustine. I mean, people say Sartre and people say Sartre, right? And people say Wittgenstein and people say Wittgenstein. I mean, just FYI, right? So if you're at a cocktail party, you could, pretend like or something, right? Okay. His goal was to try and reconcile the work of Plato with Christianity, and to figure out, how does God become man? How is our soul both of the other world and our body is of this world? His main theological work is the City of God. It contrasts this city of God with the city of man here on earth, and then this also plays out. You might have heard a city upon a hill, right, by this Massachusetts Bay Colony, Winthrop and all this business. If you haven't, don't worry about it, but that's where it comes from. But don't worry about it if you don't know what I'm talking about, just ignore it. And so he's trying to reconcile just how Plato was trying to reconcile the world of appearances with the world of the forms. Augustine wants this great chain of being, right? Just with us here and then all the way on up to God. Now, what's neat about Augustine is he writes this almost autobiographical set of memoirs called the Confessions of St. Augustine. And it explains how he found salvation. It was a kind of personal catharsis for him. And so he's moving from people talking about abstract theoretical stuff to discussing, who am I? He's not Aristotle asking questions about how to categorize man in the hierarchy of nature. He wants to know who he is. And so a good killer quote from him is, "And men go abroad to admire the heights of mountains, the mighty waves of the sea, the broad tides of rivers, the compass of the ocean, and the circuits of the stars, yet pass over the mystery of themselves without a thought." I mean, that's killer, right? And the idea is maybe some of the greatest mysteries or the most marvelous things to find are within you. You might think about it this way. I once saw this movie Phone Booth, like years ago. I don't even know when it came out. I think Colin Farrell's in it. And I don't know, he's in this phone booth and someone's going to shoot people or something unless he stays on the line. Anyway, the end of the movie, Colin Farrell said, he's wearing all these fancy clothes and stuff. And he says at the end of the movie, the reason why I wear these fancy clothes is because, and I do all this fancy stuff, is because I really don't want anyone to know deep down that I don't feel fancy. That I don't feel like the way that I appear to be. And in fact, the way that I appear is precisely as an attempt to compensate for who I am, right? And sometimes you see this with people, right? They need to wear fancy clothes so that they look very fancy. They need to be seen carrying fancy books so they can be seen as very fancy. They need to drive very fancy cars so people can think that they're very fancy. And the idea is, look, you don't define yourself by externalities. Some of the greatest things that you've got going for you are right there inside. And that's maybe part of what he means here. Another great quote from him: "I held my heart back from positively accepting anything, since I was afraid of another fall, and in this condition of suspense, I was being all the more killed." I heard another translation of this once, and it was real nice. It said something like, look, I was so worried about being wrong, I wasn't willing to reach out to God, or something like that. And this is this thinking, this idea, this paralysis of the heart that gets induced by rationality. And he's kind of on the other side of that and saying, look, rationality ain't necessarily what it's all cracked up to be, right? I held everything back because I didn't want to be wrong, but I should have just gone for it. And you can see that not always championing reason in each and every context is I think, present in that quote. All right. Saint Anselm, faith-seeking understanding. Well, let's read this in chat, but we'll get past because we're kind of running on here. If anyone does not know, either because he has not heard or because he does not believe that there is one nature, supreme among all existing things, who alone is self-sufficient in his eternal happiness, who, through his omnipotent goodness, grants and brings it about that all other things exist, or have any sort of well-being, and a great many other things that we must believe about God or his creation, I think he could at least convince himself of most of these things by reason alone, if he is even moderately intelligent. So let me just give you a takeaway from this. You don't need to know everything all the time about a religious doctrine or something like that, but it's enough that you want to know and you want to continue to justify things that you believe are true. And that's enough, right? You don't have to have, remember, maybe this is helpful. You think about Kierkegaard and how Kierkegaard says sort of things like, what use would it be if I had an argument or a set of arguments that I could hold up to all the world to prove that I was right? That's kind of a similar thing here, right? He's saying, look, you don't need to know every single thing. It's enough that you admit the limit of your understanding, but that you keep moving forward with it. All right. Let's see. Aquinas is a really important figure in the history of Christianity, and so I don't want to totally pass over him, but I don't want to get bogged down in too much of this. Aquinas is trying to square what Aristotle says with the New Testament or contemporary Christian doctrines at the time for him. And he's largely successful, right? This cat, Aquinas was the most dominant philosopher in Latin for hundreds of years, right? Maybe 14 or 1500 years, no joke. And so Aristotle kind of thought that there was some part of our mind that wasn't necessarily mechanistic or biologically determined, and that's where the individual comes in, right? Descartes has this problem. Plato kind of has this problem. How does the individual, which doesn't seem to be governed by mechanism, seems to be free, how does that fit together with this world that does seem to be somewhat mechanistic or driven by laws of cause and effect? Aristotle almost seems to be saying that there's something like God in us. Now, he doesn't say that. There are huge differences between the Christian God and what Aristotle had in mind when he said God. But Christians would call this free will. And God created us with the ability to do kind of what we want to do, what we like. And Aquinas wants to know, how can we have a kind of individuality that's not caused by the physical external world? So Aquinas says that our potential is with us at birth, right? This potential to behave in certain ways, but that in order to actualize that potential, to be all the things that we can possibly be, that's our job, right? No one can tell you what you should be, who you should, what you should or should not do. This is kind of the project of life. But with the Christian can appeal to God in that development. Atheists have to turn to themselves. All right. Scotus, I think we're going to pass on Scotus. Just a quick thing. You might have heard of the term dunce cap. When people have a dunce cap, look at this guy right there. Yes, that's where it comes from. You're welcome. All right, you guys. We're going to stop here on Martin Luther. He's our last figure, and he's interesting. Martin Luther started something called the Protestant Reformation. We're not going to get into dates, but for a long time, the Catholic Church was the only game in town. It would read the Bible to people, and it would interpret God's mandates for people. And Luther, maybe historically, it gets presented a little too there are predecessors to Luther along the way, and the Catholic Church tries to respond to Luther and his concerns with the Counter-Reformation and stuff. But as a bright line, what Martin Luther does is he nails these 95 theses to the church door. People had done stuff like that in the past, And it leads to all these kinds of problems that people in the church were kind of making happen. So the church would accept money for indulgences, right? People could pay them money in order to be relieved of their sins. And so, for instance, if you were, I don't know, a female courtesan or something, right? If you were a sex worker, you could, pay to have your sins forgiven. And I don't know, Luther's sort of saying, look, I mean, if I have this personal relationship with God, why do I have to appeal to the church to be absolved of my sins? Why can't God just do it directly, right? Cut out the middleman, so to speak. Why do I need to appeal to the structure of the church? Can't I just appeal to God directly? And so even today, I mean, this is still with us. People wonder about the relationship that they have to God and how that relates to their relationship to their own church, whether it's Protestant or so forth, right? Fellowship is a really natural thing that people feel. And what's the relationship of a group of believers to God? So Luther articulates this doctrine of two kingdoms, right? To reconcile the city of God with the city of man. But this kind of gives us this separation of the private and the public and the church and the state. He thinks that the state church shouldn't be able to intervene and dictate religious matters. The church shouldn't be intervening in state matters because we'd be imposing our own private concerns. I'm not going to really quiz you guys on it. You're not going to be tested on Martin Luther or anything. But he's an interesting figure in Christianity because he begins to bring into greater focus the individual and the individual's salvation. And then he is kind of the cause of Protestantism. But I mean, there's more to that story, right? You could do a whole class on Protestant Reformation. Okay, so we had some highlights there. The takeaways here are that there are some rich instances where you have elements of Christian thought throughout history that seem to touch on themes that we might think of as existential. And so the way that this course has been taught, remember we started with Sartre and then we moved forward, it seemed like we were reading mostly contemporaneous 20th and 21st century writers, but there are predecessor elements to that in our theological, philosophical, shared history. And also it kind of balances out the whole Schopenhauer and black metal thing. All right, you guys, thank you very much, and I will see you on Monday.